We are so lucky today to have Michael Linick here. I want to talk a little bit about what Dweebs Global is if this is your first time attending a Dweebs live session. Dweebs Global is an international mentorship organization. We provide free mentorship in everything from free resume edits to mental health advice to career advice. We have these amazing Dweebs live sessions every week on Saturday or Sunday, and we feature an amazing speaker who's sort of at the forefront of their field and can share a little bit of advice about what they do in their career and some of the cool work that they're doing. So if you have any further questions after this about how to get a career like Michael's, how to succeed in policy here in the United States or elsewhere, we are happy to help. You can just go ahead and send us a request at dweebsglobal.org/contact. So today we have Michael Linick, and we are so grateful that he's here and spending some of his afternoon with us. He is a senior defense and political science researcher at the RAND Corporation and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Strategic Studies program. He's a retired Army colonel with over 30 years as an infantry and force management officer, and so he's done a lot of research on finding ways for the Army to function more effectively and efficiently across all its functional areas. He's also worked with the Secretary of Defense more broadly on a variety of personnel policy issues. And he has an extensive experience with wargames, which is brilliantly fascinating, and what he's here to talk about today as a hobbyist, as a soldier, and at RAND. So most recently, Michael was one of the lead designers for a game called Hedgemony, a game of strategic choices, which is RAND's first ever policy game that was published for sale to the general public. And so he's going to talk a little bit about that game and about how wargaming helps us in national security and helps in the policy field, as well as just being one of, I think, the coolest careers ever. So welcome to Michael. Thank you so much for taking the time today. We're so excited to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm more than happy to be here and excited to share some of this with you all. I'm interested to hear what your questions are later. As far as said, my name is Mike Linick. Spent a lot of time in the Army doing a lot of different things, and I've been at RAND for about 7 years now. And you know, the truth is that one day in 2016, 17, one of my colleagues walked into my office and said, "Hey, you like to play war games, don't you? Or board games?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, can you come spend 2 days with us playing games?" It's like, okay, I'm happy to do that. Why would anybody want to pay me to play games? But the deal was that they had gotten a contract from the Department of Defense to develop a game. And as part of the design process, they were going to spend 2 days playing a wide variety of commercial games to see what it was about different kinds of games that helped enable different kinds of learning and different kinds of engagement. And I went along with that, and at the end of it, I ended up becoming the lead designer for a game for the first time in my life, although I'd been a lifelong war gamer. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about all of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what war games are and what they aren't. I'm going to talk a little bit about the design process for a war game. And then I'll talk specifically about Hedgemony, the game that my colleagues and I designed for the Department of Defense, which we determined actually had a lot of teaching value. And so RAND agreed to try to market it so that public policy students and professionals who have an interest in national security could use it as a learning tool. So again, lifelong engagement with war games, and I'll talk in that engagement a little bit about the different kinds of games there are. When I was 8 or 9, 10 years old, my family was on vacation, and one of my cousins had a friend who had a game called 1914. It was by a company called Avalon Hill, and it was a representation of World War I on the Western Front. And it was my first experience of a formal war game, as opposed to just playing with G.I. Joe or playing Cowboys and Indians or something with my friends out in the backyard or down at the park. I found it fascinating. I found it interesting. I was already interested in military history and history in general, and I got hooked. Several years later, I was actually at the first ever wargaming convention I went to, and I found out that there were other kinds of games. So 1914 used little cardboard counters to represent military units. It assigned sort of a movement value and a combat value to them. It placed them on a map that had a hexagonal grid on it to sort of control and regulate movement. And it had a set of charts and tables that let you sort of figure out how to resolve different kinds of interactions, attacking and defending, taking into account things like terrain and type of unit and things like that. A typical, what we would think of today as a board war game. At the convention, I learned about something called miniatures, where we used scale representations of real things. So little 15 or 25 millimeter soldiers, or scaled 15 millimeter tanks or airplanes, played on huge collections of ping pong tables, all set together with pieces of felt and other kinds of things used to represent terrain. And again, a set of rules that sort of created the parameters under which you could move and use these representations, these miniatures, and put them on the table and interact in movement and combat to find some sort of a military result. But I also found out at that convention there was a new game. It was about 1.5 years old at the time. It was called Dungeons and Dragons. And that was a completely different kind of a game that really was all up in your head and made up. But there were some charts and tables, again, to help sort of resolve and understand interactions. It was narrative driven. There was a game master. These are kinds of things that I hadn't really been exposed to before. And so I did that all through my teen years and ended up enlisting in the Army eventually in 1983. And in the Army, I got exposed to a whole wide range of new kinds of war games. And these were live war games where I was one of the counters, if you will, or one of the leaders, and maneuvering my soldiers around on a battlefield and having umpires or observer controllers adjudicating our results, or having a MILES, a multiple integrated laser engagement system, adjudicating results when sort of a high-speed progenitor of what you guys would do in laser tag, which is a different kind of a war game. And then even later in my Army career, I got involved in things like the Army's Battle Command Training Program, where they use a combination of different kinds of computer simulations and live interactions to train staffs and commanders on how to think about different kinds of combat interactions on a scale that you just can't do with a normal live exercise, but which the computer systems allow you to integrate. So you learn this whole spectrum. And then finally, in my senior years in the Army and my years at RAND, I started to learn about these things that were called seminar war games, which are the kind of a game where you have some sort of a scenario given to you and you sit around and talk about it. And you interact with some subject matter experts and you come to some sort of conclusions based on that. And so it's kind of a seminar. It's kind of a bunch of guys sitting around talking, and that's what they're often called, a bog sat, a bunch of guys sitting around talking. It can be guys and gals these days sitting around talking. It wasn't quite as formal as the kinds of games I'd been exposed to before. So that was kind of the spectrum. I was exposed to it throughout my entire life, but I'd never designed a game. I mean, like all of you, I'd probably taken a game that I liked and made up my own rules to it, or changed it a little bit, or added a chart or a table. And certainly if you've ever, again, Dungeons and Dragons or those kinds of games, you have some role in creating the specifics of a scenario, but not the same as, Gary Gygax writing the first 3 books of rules for the game. So what is a war game? What differentiates it from other kinds of tools? So first off, we have models. You can create a model, you can create a computer model, you can create a very simple model, and that sort of is a representation of how things work, but it's not necessarily interactive or human, and it generally tends to be either deterministic or somewhat, sort of stochastic, just sort of probability based, but it doesn't involve the inject of human will. So models are interesting and they're useful for some things. You have formal simulations like a flight simulator, or that take physical things that we can monitor and measure and replicate them in a computer environment, and then you can expose them in different ways to different stimulus and see how they act based on that. But again, there's generally not human interaction, there's not human will, or if it is, it's completely or at least partially probabilistic, as opposed to based on cognitive decisions on the part of humans. And so what a war game does, or any game does, is it puts the human into it. And it involves your imagination, it involves narrative, it involves emotion, it involves competition. And so it exercises our learning at a very different level of component. But it's not good for everything. There's things it can be good for and things it's not very good for. Originally, war games were designed to help military professionals learn. The last thing you want to do on a battlefield or in a war is face a situation for the very first time and not have been able to think through what are the likely outcomes. So war games allow you to create the kinds of situations that you're likely to encounter and to simulate them, but in a gaming environment where you get this violent clash of wills that Clausewitz would say is the hallmark of wars, the fog and friction that hallmark wars, and your emotions involved. And you can play through what ifs and think ahead of time of how you might react to that. And in fact, all armies do this a lot, and through things like those kinds of war games, as they sort of strategize how an enemy might confront them, they start amending their plans. But it also means, again, that as a soldier, when I'm on the battlefield and I encounter something, if I've already encountered it in a game 2 or 3 or 10 or 12 times, then I'm more likely to be able to come to a more correct decision more rapidly than if it's the first time I've seen it. So that's one of the rules for games. You gain experience, you gain exposure, you learn how to think about events, and you learn how to sort of think about them differently than you might have done just based on a theoretical understanding of what was going to happen. But the other thing games can do is they can highlight key issues or friction points, key areas where something doesn't quite seem right, or where you start to get outcomes that you didn't really expect. Maybe you can validate that outcomes you did expect are actually likely to happen, but it helps you learn about how events might play out. And it lets you do it in a relatively cheap and relatively easy and sometimes relatively fast way. What I would tell you is it doesn't answer questions very well. The game will not tell you what will happen. There's no certainty involved. The game will not tell you that your strategy is the right strategy. It will not tell you that your doctrine is the right doctrine. But it will tell you that if you're going to use that strategy, or if you're going to use that doctrine, that these are the areas where it's more likely to be successful. These are the areas where it's less likely to be successful. These are the areas where there's going to be friction or conflict, and where there is room for you to do more formal analysis. And that's where you can turn lessons learned from a game into now a more formal simulation or model, and you can do some of that other kind of work. And I'll talk about sort of an experience of that that we experienced at RAND. So in RAND, after observing Russia's activities in the Crimea and the Ukraine back in 2014, we said, well, what would happen, just a speculation, if the Russians tried to do something like that in the Baltics? We didn't have a contract with the Department of Defense to do this. We just sort of asked the question, and internally we found some funding to explore that question. And so we set up a kind of a war game where we posited what a Russian invasion of the Baltics would likely look like. And what we knew today was, today being 2014, what the defenses of the Baltics looked like. And we came to a set of conclusions, which was essentially that there was nothing currently in the Baltics that the Russians couldn't reasonably overcome in as quickly as 60 hours, should they want to. So that was what we learned. We learned that really there's nothing defensible about the Baltics as it is right now. So we reset the game and we played it again, and this time we asked a different question. What might it take if we wanted to stop the Russians from being able to do it in 60 hours and cause them to spend 20 or 30 or 40 days, or could it be stopped at all? And so we started a series over 6 months of a whole bunch of games that were all designed to see what kind of forces could plausibly be used to prevent this Russian invasion from rapidly accomplishing its objectives. And then once we'd done that and we sort of had an idea of what the force was that was necessary to do that, we reset the game again and we played it. And we looked at, could you even get those forces there? A different question, sort of the same game mechanics. And each time we're learning, and we're learning more about how Russia and NATO would interact in these kinds of things. And we started to get a lot of press from NATO partners, from the US military, and we got them engaged now in really understanding what kind of a threat might be occurring in the Baltics. And we never ever said, and we never will and never have, that we think Russia will invade the Baltics. This was all speculation. If the Russians decided they wanted to, what might it look like? And there's no simulation and no model that's going to tell you the answer to that. You had to game it out. And by gaming it out, we learned not just about the questions I asked, but we found out why it was so easy and some of the issues with what's called A2AD, or anti-access area denial, and the way the Russians' integrated air defense systems interact with our long-range fighters and long-range bombers and F-22s and all that kind of stuff. We started learning a lot about how those interact that we frankly just didn't know or understand before. And that's allowed the military to think about how they want to think about the next war differently. So that was all from games. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about terms in games, because I'll sprinkle them through. Typically in games that we design, that are the war games that the Department of Defense uses, you're going to hear people talking about the red player or the blue player or the green player or the white cell. So typically in the West, the friendly country, the country that you represent, is called blue. You know, the enemy country is called red. If there are neutrals, or if there are other actors on in the battle space that you want to account for, they're generically called green. And the dungeon master, the person who sort of runs it and adjudicates it and rolls the dice and kind of interprets the rules, that's called the white cell. And so you'll hear people use those terms in the games, and I'll use them when I talk about hegemony. I've used the term adjudication. So again, in a game, you're going to have an interaction between a red and a blue unit, or a red and a green unit, or a blue and a green unit. And you want to understand, what was the outcome of that interaction? Was it an attack, a defense? Was it an attempt to block a road? Those all need to be decided. And so you have a set of rules, or you have a set of subject matter experts. And those rules or subject matter experts help you understand what the outcome of that interaction was. And then you factor that new reality into the next part of the gameplay. And so there's a lot of adjudication involved in games. And what makes games effective is when both players, both teams, agree that the adjudication is fair and reasonable. If the adjudication is crazy, if, you know, every monster you come into has the plus 27 sword of the Balrog, and you all have minus 23 armor, it's not an interesting game. You don't become invested in it, and you sort of walk away from it because you don't think that's fair or reasonable. So one of the key aspects of games is to have this agreement that the adjudication is fair and reasonable and makes sense. Some other kinds of things that happen in games, and that adjudication, by the way, can be completely mechanical. It can be a computer table, a computer outcome, but you have to agree that the computer's coming to the right outcomes. It can be a set of tables, and it can be subject matter experts saying, I rule that this is the way it is. Some other things that you'll see in games. So some games are turn-based. I go, you go. Some games are free play. Everything's happening simultaneously. There's no sort of rules about when you can do things. You do it when you can do it. Some games are simultaneous. So I will decide what I'm going to do, and I'll inform the white cell. Red will say what they're going to do, and they'll inform the white cell. And then everything will be adjudicated simultaneously and not sequentially. These all impact how gameplay is resolved and how the players get invested in the game. The other thing that I'll say specifically is, if you guys want to sit around the table on a Friday night with beer and pizza and play a game and be entertained by it, that's awesome. You don't sit around afterwards and write down, what did I learn by playing the game tonight? But if you're going to spend tens of thousands or hundreds of millions of dollars running a major military war game, at the end of it, you want to make sure you've captured the lessons that are learned. So part of designing the game is designing a game that is going to make sure that you learn what it is you want to learn while leaving room to learn things you didn't know you wanted to learn. So again, to go back to my Baltics example, we knew what we wanted to learn was what the likelihood was of these different interactions between Russia and NATO. What we didn't expect to learn was as much as we did about the way the military systems of both sides interacted to create that outcome. We thought we already knew most of that, and we found out that we didn't. But we wrote it all down. And we used those lessons learned to shape how we did the next game, and then eventually how we changed doctrine, policy, and even to some extent, US war plans. All right, so that brings us to hegemony. So again, in 2017, the Trump administration, been in power for about a year, decides they're going to write a new national security strategy. The Department of Defense comes to Rand, and the people who are responsible for at least drafting the initial ideas for the strategy say, we need a sandbox. We need something we can play in, play a game in, where we can test out multiple strategic ideas rapidly, because we don't have a lot of time. So we want to be able to play a sufficient number of turns to learn what we want to learn about the strategy. And we want to be able to do that in 4 hours. And we want this game sometime in the next 6 weeks, because we have a strategy to write. And so the challenge for us was, well, what is the kinds of things that we think you need to learn, or what are the kinds of things you want to learn, because a learning objective is a part of the game. And then how can we take something as complex as national military strategy in the Department of Defense and condense it into something where you could play a reasonable number of turns in 4 hours? And so this is where somebody knocked on my door and said, come play games with us for 2 days. And so we did, and we played a variety of different games, of a variety of different types. And we sat around and we talked about how cards, like you might see in a game Dominion or Cards Against Humanity or something like that, how did they change game dynamics? How did dice versus tables change game dynamics? How did I go, you go versus simultaneous change game dynamics? And we found through this process of looking at all these different games, what we liked and what we didn't like, but we gained exposure to a variety of different kinds of ways to play games, to structure games that were above and beyond sort of these classic military hex-based games or miniature-based games or whatever. Because this was really a policy game, not a war game. It's a national strategy. So the next thing we did was we sat down, we spent another 2 or 3 days talking about, well, what is it that's really happening at the national strategic level? And this is where things got really interesting, because we sort of came to an agreement that we believed that there are really 5 things that significantly impact national strategy. The first one is the budget. Strategy is budget constrained. And so any game about national strategy had to have a component where the budget was a constraint on your freedom of action. You had to pay for what you did. The second thing we decided was that although there's literally tens of thousands of different things that the Department of Defense spends money on, and they all interact in different ways to produce different kinds of capabilities, we believed we could abstract those up into 4 things. We could abstract it into how big was your military, how modern was your military, or rather what was the distribution of modernization in your military, where you always had some pieces less modern and some pieces more modern. How ready was your military? How ready to fight tonight versus how much time did it need to get ready to fight? And where did you have your military postured or stationed, and for what purposes? And everything we thought that the Department of Defense spends money on, we thought could fit into one of those 4 buckets. And so we decided that we were going to design a game around those 4 factors. And what we did was, there was 5 of us on the design team. We gave everybody 24 hours. We'd all spent 4 days, two days just looking at game mechanics, 2 days just looking at Department of Defense mechanics. We all got 24 hours to go back and come up with a really rough prototype of a game. a general description of how we wanted to play it, a general description of how the game would go, and what kinds of artifacts we would need to use. And we came back after that 24 hours and we Shark Tanked it. Each person sort of pitched their game to the other four, and then we sort of dissected it and talked about it. And at the end, for whatever reason, my prototype was the one that we selected as the basis of the game we were going to go on to design. And the basis of my game, which yet didn't have a name, was that excuse me, the Department of Defense uses a strategic planning cycle, and the strategic planning cycle goes something like this. You sit down and you assess both the world environment and what the United States wants to accomplish. And as part of assessing the world environment, you sort of get from your intelligence briefers what they think Russia is likely to be doing in the near future or in the far future. What do they think China is likely to be doing, in Iran and North Korea? What are the kinds of things that are going to happen around the world that are going to either create challenges or opportunities for the United States? And that's an intel briefing. It's an environmental scan of what's out there. And then you go through a planning process where you say, well, okay, this is what intelligence is telling me might happen or is what they think is happening based on the signaling or intelligence they're gathering from these other countries. What do I want to do about it? And you go through a proactive planning phase that's based on two things. First off, what is it you wanted to do anyhow? What was your strategy? What was your plan for doing things? And second, how does your perception of these other countries' activities cause you to need to change what you might otherwise have done? Where do you want to take direct action to counter it? Where might you want to take indirect action to hedge against it? And where do you want to just ignore it as part of the normal world kind of events? And when you plan for something, it tends to be a little bit cheaper than when you have to rush to react to something relatively quickly. So we would allow the blue player to make some decisions during this investment phase that would allow that player to further their own strategic objectives and to hedge against what the enemy might do. And it would be relatively cheap for them to do that. And the kinds of decisions that they could make go back to those four levers that we talked about. They could change the size of their force. They could grow more forces, but that costs money. They could modernize part of their force and make it more effective, but that costs money. They could reposition part of their force so that it was where they thought the threat had moved to or where they thought the opportunity existed, but that costs money. They could change the readiness level of the force. They could save money by reducing readiness. They could spend money and increase readiness. And they could do all of these things as well as doing other kinds of investments that fall under the rubric of modernization, such as investing in very specific kinds of technologies. And the kinds that we came up with for the game were what's called C4ISR, which is sort of your command and control and intelligence and surveillance regime that allows you to see what's happening in the world or see what's happening on the battlefield and make and execute decisions based on that. Or maybe it was integrated air and missile defense was the technology that you really wanted to invest in because so many of our threats have different kinds of missile capabilities that we find difficult to engage. Or maybe one of our comparative advantages is in special operations capabilities. So you'd want to invest in special operations capabilities. The next part of the game then was that blue would actually make some of these investments, do these reposturing, and then the red players would actually make their moves based on what had been signaled. And so the idea was that when red signaled that they might do A, B, or C, and it was their turn, they could do A or B or C. They could do A and B, A and C, but they couldn't do D. They couldn't do something that they hadn't sort of signaled. So we sort of artificially took away the element of complete surprise from the game, but that was part of us helping to make sure we did our learning objectives right. And then blue could choose to react to those events. But because they were reacting reactively, it tended to be more expensive than if they had reacted proactively. And they could choose not to act if they wanted to. And then we would adjudicate all of those, and then we would give everybody enough money to seed them, for the budget for the next turn, and we'd sort of do a recap and move on. And we'd go through this cycle where you could see how your strategy interacted with the red players. And the kinds of things that red players could do during their turn, they could invest in their own technologies and create sort of an arms race, if you will. They could increase or modernize their militaries, also sort of an arms race. But they could actually do things like a gray zone activity, sort of like what Russia had done in the Ukraine. They could do things like an actual invasion, sort of like Russia had done in the Crimea, or might threaten to do in the Baltics, if you will. We gave subject matter experts for each of the 4 threat countries we chose, which were the threat countries identified by the strategy team as the ones of concern: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, a wide range of different activities they could do. And we then decided that the US would try to react to them. And we started playing this game and prototyping it and testing it over a 5 or 6 week period. From that, we decided that we also needed to add random events that could happen inside of a country and either constrain or empower that country. So a coup, or a financial bonanza, or an intelligence loss, or an intelligence success might change countries' technologies or budgets or something like that, or constrain their political actions or military actions for a period, or force them into military action for a period. We also realized that there's this whole world that doesn't consist of those 4 red countries and blue. So we started crafting rules for our NATO and EU partners to have an active voice as opposed to a passive one. We started creating international event cards where people could compete to react or choose not to react to a famine in Africa or to a terrorist strike somewhere else. And all of these were designed to create opportunities for international events which would force blue to make a decision about whether or not they thought reacting to that event was within their strategy or outside of their strategy. And regardless of whether it was in or out, whether or not they would react to it. And the idea behind all that was to, again, test the strategy for blue and see if their strategy was robust to the world changing, to it being different than what they had posited it might be. And we were able to play the game in a couple different ways. We could take a single strategy and we could play 3 different world environments. One where we directed the red players to be docile and cooperative, one where we asked them to be very aggressive, and one where they were somewhere in the middle. And you could see how the same strategy played out in 3 different worlds. You could do the other way. You could say, I'm going to run it 3 times. I want you guys to run the same general strategy. You can use different cards each time, but I want you to run the same general strategy, and I'm going to run 3 different blue strategies against it and see which one is most effective, or which one has the most characteristics of what I'm looking for when measured against that strategy. And so that's what we did. And one of the things we found as we did all this was that there was a lot of learning going on. And as we observed that learning, we realized that for people who were not professionals at this, and even for people who were, this game was a great way to help expose them to strategic discussions and to strategy at a highly abstract level. Instead of focusing on, do I buy lasers or do I buy drones? Let's really talk at a level that defense strategy should be, which all too often we don't do. And so we talked with our sponsor, and they agreed that it would be okay for us to develop this further to make it a commercial game. We convinced RAND to fund us to develop it as a commercial game, first time they'd ever been asked to do that, and agreed to it. And we finally published our game about a month ago. And we are inundated constantly with requests from foreign governments, from domestic policy institutions, whether they're academic institutions or government agencies, who all want to use this game to help understand policy, or at least understand the game better so they can understand how they can use it to teach policy to their own people, or to think through their own strategies, or adapt it for the kind of strategies they do. And I'll shut up now, because that was a lot of talking, and I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have about games, gaming, life in the DoD, life at Rand, or Hedgemony itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I know I learned so much. I love listening to you talk about this because it's something that I find particularly incredibly interesting. I play a lot of board games and I've played a lot of war games, and I think that's super, super cool that you've actually created one. That sounds so hard. So everyone who is attending, and I'm so sorry about the Zoom link mess up earlier. I'm so glad more of you have been able to join. If you guys have any questions to ask Michael, please drop them in the chat, DM to me, or email. I do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. So to start off, we have a question about why people trust war games and if people trust them as much as they would trust a simulation. So sort of what can real people playing this game give you information about that you couldn't do using a computer or sort of a traditional model?
So I'm not sure that all people trust war games, but the reason that the ones who do, I think, is, you know, we try to educate people all the time about the limits of what you can learn from a war game. A war game allows you to ask smarter questions. It doesn't really answer questions well. And because we tend to limit the claim of what we learned from the war game to that, I think you buy a little bit of trust. There are a lot of people who have a tremendous amount of faith in simulations without really understanding what's being simulated. You know, it's sort of a black box to them, and they don't know what the parameters inside that box are, but it's pretty scientific. It's math, you know, 2 and 2 always equals 4, so this must be right. And so you do get sort of a false sense of security until you've been taught skepticism about simulations. The best things are when you can use the 2 in combination. So again, when we were doing our work in the Baltics, we had these questions about what happens when you try to fly an unmanned aerial vehicle through a Russian radar environment. And we couldn't answer that in the game, but we could ask our simulators, to the people at Rand who do simulations, to put that into a simulator and tell us, you know, what's the percentage likelihood that this UAV will actually be able to fly its route without being detected, fly its route without being shot down. And we could get sort of this distribution of likely outcomes from flying UAVs through that kind of a radar thing using the simulation. And then we could take that back to help us adjudicate what was happening in the game. So if something in the game absolutely depended on being able to fly these UAVs through that environment, we could adjust our adjudication tables to reflect what we had learned from the simulation. And so they work really well interactively, but I wouldn't trust 100% either one of them unless you absolutely are sure you understand that you've captured all the variables and that you understand what the variables are. So when they simulate the takeoff of the space shuttle or the flight characteristics of the space shuttle, those physics are pretty well understood, but human will isn't a part of that. And so it's much more easier to simulate. Anything that involves human interaction, you get a lot more difficulty in simulation. And that's where war games come more to the fore. Is, again, without telling you what's going to happen, they help you understand the kinds of things that might.
Thank you. And I think for me, I sort of get it. I sort of feel like war games, clearly there's so much you can learn from what participants choose to do and how they think about it. You might even find scenarios you didn't expect to happen. One question we got was sort of related to that, which is, has there ever been a case, to the extent you can share, of course, where the government played a war game, or where you created a war game, or you were involved in a war game situation where it really produced some sort of national security outcome? It saved lives, it changed strategy, it impacted the way we look at things, to the extent you could share, of course.
So there's actually lots of documentation of cases like that. And if you look at the United States Marine Corps, they did an extensive series of war games between World War I and World War II on the assumption that a mission that would be necessary in the next war would be amphibious warfare. And they didn't really know what that would look like or how to do it. And so just like we did this series of games in the Baltics, that each time we sort of advanced the question to a different area or different level, they did that with amphibious doctrine. And so the amphibious doctrine that was used by the Marine Corps and then adopted in many ways by the Army throughout World War II is a direct outcome of a series of war games. same thing. Lieutenant General Wallace commanded a corps during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And he and his staff wargamed that invasion quite a bit. And he's on the record as saying that lessons that they learned, ideas and concepts that arose from that wargaming experience fundamentally changed the way they approached that invasion, and he believes saved a lot of lives.
Wow, that's incredible. And that just shows how important this is and how important your work is to security and just to thinking about new challenges we face. Love that example. So sort of going back to something you talked a little bit about before, human factors and the fact that you can't really predict what people are going to do. We have a question, would like to know your take on the importance of those human factors in sort of making that game and creating that game, and specifically what parts of human factor education or psychology, what experts did you consult in those areas, and how did you insert that into the game?
So, yeah, it's a great question. First off, again, the interaction of people changes dynamics in ways that the interaction of icons in a simulation don't. We actually felt compelled to put like victory conditions into our game because that engages people. If there's no stakes to the game, they become less engaged. So we created this idea that national strategy is about shifting influence. It's about creating the opportunities to influence world events. So we sort of abstracted this thing called influence points, and all actions in Hedgemony result in changes in either budget or unit availability, but mostly in relative influence points. In the game, which can have multiple winners and multiple losers, is all built around how relative influence changes around the world throughout the execution of this strategy. So that gets that necessary sort of like victory conditions gets people emotionally invested. In a game like Hedgemony, sort of like in Dungeons and Dragons, the other thing that really happens is you get narrative involved. So we can build a card that says, you know, Russia conducts gray zone activity against a non-NATO partner. But that's not what the player says. You know, what the player actually has to do now is create a narrative around this. And so we use for our 4 red players and our green players and NATO, we use regional experts. And they could come in and they could say, well, you know, the ongoing situation in Nagorno-Karabakh has been a big concern to the Putin administration. And so what you're going to observe this turn, we think, is the potential for Russia to do a gray zone type of activity that's going to look like this in Nagorno-Karabakh. And it gets people involved in the narrative. And now when blue is deciding whether they're going to play, it's not just a question of, well, my strategy says to ignore the South Caucasus. It's, this is Nagorno-Karabakh, you know, what are we going to do about that, and whatever. And so you get people drawn in and involved in that, and that adds a lot of nuance. It adds a lot of flavor. You find out that some people have emotional touch points. You know, it's again, you know, the strategy might be, we're going to ignore, this is the Department of Defense. We're going to ignore every humanitarian crisis that comes along because that's not our job. And then you play a card that says, you know, there's a huge famine in Somalia and these people's emotions get involved. And it's not a question of influence points. It's how can the United States not get involved in Somalia? And when you say, well, there's no way other than the Department of Defense to react, all of a sudden people who thought strategically they would never do this get invested in doing it. And then you can have this great conversation about, okay, how good was your strategy? What do you need to think about differently in your strategy given the way these range of emotions have played on you, or given the fact that you didn't want to lose influence, even though you told us before that you didn't care about influence in that region. And so you don't get that from a model or from a simulation.
That's amazing. And it actually parlays directly into the next question we have, which is, specifically surrounding people's emotions regarding people dying. So sort of your take on Somalia, for example, which is a great example. Do people play, I know when I'm playing games, I love to just randomly play war games and kill a lot of people because it's fun and it's a game. How do you balance that out with the fact that you're trying to learn lessons about real life? Are people likelier in general to kill people in a game or go to war, or be a little more risk takers when it's not real lives on the line? And how do you play that back when you're trying to give advice to the real Department of Defense when this time it's real lives on the line, real people might be dying, that sort of thing?
So how that comes into play depends a lot on what kind of game you're playing. So when we were doing a lot of work on the Baltics, there were a lot of cases where a lot of people died. You know, we had experience in Iraq and Afghanistan where 100 people dying a month was considered sort of catastrophic, and we had cases in these games where we would project that thousands of people would die in a day, you know, on both sides. And so that does then sort of factor into, is that really a risk I'm willing to take, or how much more would it take to mitigate that down, or whatever. And again, in that particular situation, most of us have some experience with actually being the guy next to the guy who's getting shot, you know. And so you bring that in, although the policymakers don't always have that experience. To them, it's sort of an abstract. When you get up to higher level games, you do have to sort of remind people what the human cost is at times, because they do tend to get focused on the political cost. And so you have to ask those questions is, all right, we can tell you what your influence change might be abroad, but what about this human cost and your influence at home? And so you can introduce that in. Again, you know, it's something that for many of us is tacitly understood that we all take that into account, but sometimes it has to be explicitly mentioned. And yeah, when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or when you're playing 1914 at home, it's really easy to just slaughter people left and right without it. But when you understand that there really are policy implications, again, the game doesn't answer the question. The game lets you ask smarter questions. And one of the aspects of that smarter question is it worth the human cost?
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I know we're coming up on the hour here, but if you have 10 minutes, I'd love to ask if you have it to spend, answer a few more questions. I know we had to start late, and my apologies to our audience for that. Thank you so much, Michael, and no worries at all if you have something to go to. So
no, absolutely. I know we started at a quarter after.
We have a million more questions in my inbox, so I want to at least get to a few of them. First, we have a sort of a little bit off from what we were talking about before, specifically about the book, The Art of War. How have some of those strategies evolved in modern warfare, and what are your thoughts about that book specifically?
You talking about Sun Tzu and The Art of War? Because there's been several books called The Art of War, but I think most people talk about Sun Tzu. So, I mean, you know, Sun Tzu is most famous, I think, for advocating what we would think of today as the indirect approach. And so designing games that allow for an indirect approach is certainly something that happens, you know. And in fact, if you think about some higher level policy games where what you're trying to do is not just use military force, but you're actually considering things like diplomatic, informational, or economic, either punishments or rewards. Those are all kinds of things that Sun Tzu would say go into it. But ultimately, I mean, war games are a great expression of Sun Tzu. One of his most famous comments is, you know, the great general can win the war without ever having to fight a battle. And the way he talks about you doing that is you have to know your enemy and you have to know yourself. And games are a way to help you know your enemy and to know yourself. Again, you do this learning on the tabletop or at the game rather than in the combat or in the conflict. And you start to learn what you can and can't do, what the enemy can and can't do. And that allows you to make a better strategy for how you're actually going to act.
That's amazing. I'm so glad to hear there are lessons that you can continue to take from that book. I know in most of my policy discussions, I think most of us go with, oh, that's so outdated. It's very it's one very militaristic, old-fashioned way of looking at the world. So it's good to know that some of those lessons are still applicable. We sort
So
of.
it's funny because
Mhm.
I mentioned that I teach at Georgetown as an adjunct, and one of the classes I teach is on strategy. And so early in the strategy course, we do Sun Tzu, Kautilya, who was a Indian thinker along the lines of Sun Tzu, and Machiavelli very early in the course. And they provide a very strong foundation for discussions of much more modern theory. They're all still very relevant
Yeah, and that's very interesting, and
today.
I think that it tells a lot about human nature that in many ways that basis hasn't changed, and so it's very fascinating to hear your thoughts on that. I'm going to actually jump a little bit in the order. We have this great question about if it's harder for people in the United States to play the red team realistically. So a little bit more about back to your game and how it works. Do you sort of have a patriotism bias? Is the patriotism bias affect the ability to be able to play the game effectively? And how do you take that into account when reading out lessons?
So when we did this for the Department of Defense, we found within RAND regional experts, people whose entire professional life was dedicated to thinking like Russians or thinking like Iran or thinking like North Korea or thinking like China. That said, I don't always agree with them, based on my own studies for those. And so, yeah, you do have to be careful about picking red players who are going to realistically represent the kinds of things red is likely to do. But we do that by trying to find the right kinds of experts. If you're running this in a policy course or something else, then we actually think that's one of the learning aspects of the game, is that since you don't have access to those kinds of subject matter experts, you have a chance for your students or your policy members to get put into that position of having to learn how to think like the enemy. And again, it goes back to caveating what you really learn from a game. So to come away from a game and say Russia will behave this way because a Western subject matter expert said that is wrong. To understand that here's a range of behaviors that Russia might exhibit, and we've tested the strategy against that range, is useful. And somewhere in that range, you're likely to have hit on what Russia's likely to do. There are some black swan kinds of things, and the first time Russia did a real gray zone activity, it probably had not been gamed before by anybody in the West, but it certainly has been since. So you got to keep learning. You never get the final answer to anything. But we do try to pay very close attention to making sure that we have the right expertise to, as best we can, replicate what we think the other countries will do. And the same thing, when you have a US policy person playing NATO, you get a different sort of feature of the alliance relation in the game played than when we brought in NATO players. and they represented their countries, differently than maybe even an American NATO expert would have. And our NATO experts were guys who had spent 5, 10, 15 years on NATO staff or in the EU institutions working at that level. So it's not like we had, just theoretical knowledge of it.
Wow, that's super fascinating to me. I think I had made the error of assuming humans probably think extremely similarly everywhere. So if you have the same starting game conditions, people are going to play similarly. So that is extremely fascinating to hear, because that's a surprise to me, and that's got to be really hard to balance for. We've been talking a little bit about the lessons that you take away from the game. We have a question that's more from someone who's more on the business side of the house, wondering how, if they play games, whether it's Hedgemony or any other game they're hanging out and playing, you mentioned some like Dungeons and Dragons, what sort of questions do you ask at the end of the game to glean those policy lessons from? And what sorts of questions can people, when they play games, ask? You sort of talked about if you're drinking beer, having pizza, you're not thinking after the game, what did I learn? But if you did want to learn from those experiences, what sorts of questions do you ask? What sorts of questions can they ask to learn lessons about leadership or policy or business or anything else?
So with regards to a game like Hegemony, I mean, the first thing is you're testing a strategy. So the question that we ask continuously through the game and at the end is, based on the decisions you made and the outcomes you observed, what kind of strategic regret do you have? And strategic regret, is different than an observation that I just got unlucky, because both things can happen. You might have exactly the right strategy you might think you did, and just some unlucky event, Clausewitz's friction, intervened and meant that you couldn't achieve what you wanted to achieve. On the other hand, you could look and you say, if I knew then what I know now, I would have made this decision differently. So war and outcomes all have a probabilistic aspect to it, and separating where probability just rolled against you, where the pollers all said it's an 80% chance this guy's going to win, and it was the other guy that did, that happens. That's probability in war. But knowing then, well, what would you have done differently? How would you have hedged against it? How would you have changed your strategy to accommodate it? That is the kind of the questions we're asking at the end of the game. The other kinds of questions that we would ask really had to do with, where did you find tensions? Where did you find that your strategy caused you to have to sit and make a decision you didn't anticipate having to make? Again, like the Somalia kind of a thing. And is that something that you want to amend your strategy to account for, or do you just sort of accept that there are going to be things that are going to come along? But we're trying to help people write a strategy. We're trying to help them think through strategic thinking. And so what we're trying to do is help them understand where there was tensions between what they thought they wanted to do and what they decided they had to do, and between what they hoped the outcomes would be and what they actually were, that could be attributed to the way the strategy was devised and executed, as opposed to just chance and probability in war. When you guys are sitting around at home learning a game or talking about a game or something, it sounds kind of weird. I mean, there's little things you can learn other than just human dynamics and interactions, which you're observing and learning, but probably not stuff you want to, why did you get so mad when I won that, or, whatever. But you do start to learn a little bit about probability and probability distributions. You do start to learn a little bit about, again, sometimes risk is worth it, even if it doesn't pan out. And how do you think about risk, and how do you think about probability in different ways? But you also probably, every bridge player has gone back and replayed a hand and said, well, what if I had played this card instead of that card? Every gamer's gone and said, can I reset it back 2 turns and make a different decision? And so you really are sort of learning, even if you're not formally documenting it, about sort of how to think into the future differently. How could I have foreseen or forecast? And I keep going back to this word hedge, which is where the game hegemony came from, because it's not spelled like the United States wants to be the world's hegemon. We put a D in there because the United States has to hedge against uncertainty, against this world where almost anything could happen and we can't be prepared for everything everywhere. So how do we minimize regret? How do we create a strategy that allows us to be where we have to be, without, even if that might not happen, while still allowing us a freedom to be where we need to be, but we didn't know ahead of time that we needed to be there. And you learn that when you're playing a game at home too, is how to sort of think through futures differently, and then create your own hedging strategy against the uncertainty of that future.
That's incredible. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the extra time as well. I know we still have a lot of questions about policy and your thoughts about all sorts of different things. We also received a lot of comments about how educational and insightful this has been and how cool your work is. So I want to pass that along. I also just want to wrap up with this last question from Jenny. How many copies of Hegemony have been sold, and what happened to your copy of it?
So I don't think anybody at RAND, including us, quite expected the reception we got. The last count I heard was we had sold over 160 copies. It's actually on back order right now. If you go buy a copy, and I'll admit it's not cheap. It's a $250 game right now. because it was pitched for institutions. But if you go, we can't guarantee delivery before the end of November, I don't think, because we're on back order. So my copy of the game went to a customer, and when they eventually catch up to the back order, I'll get my copy. Although I have access to 3 or 4 prototype versions as we went through the design process. So so there's that. And I will just say, so we're already talking both to Rand and some other people about trying to find ways to make the game more digitally accessible, which would drive the price down and get access to it a little easier. We're talking about whether or not we'll create a forum for the game like you typically see with computer games these days. So there's a lot to follow on what comes next with Hedgemony, but for right now, we're just sort of enjoying watching the sales and getting daily inquiries from people who want to use us or our game to answer interesting policy questions.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and pop this question in, since I definitely want to get this out, although we will end after this. Just quickly, are there any opportunities for students to get involved in your work or in helping you build the online version? This is not from an American student, so if this is opportunities for students around the world.
So not that I'm aware of right now. You know, again, we don't know what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. There's intellectual property and copyright stuff that's so far above my pay grade and so far outside of my area of expertise that I'm just waiting for the corporate and lawyer folks to sort of figure out how and what we want to do, or more how, and then we'll sort of figure out a way forward. But we'll see, and stay tuned. Check us out at rand.org. Just type Hedgemony into the search engine and you'll get whatever we have most recently. If you're really interested, we've been covered in Russia. We've been covered in Lithuania. We've been covered, I think, in China. Several pieces recently in US press that all give you different reviews of the game, all generally favorable. I was actually really pleasantly surprised at what a good review we got from the Russians. So that was pretty cool.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, and congratulations on all that success. It's been an absolute privilege and pleasure to have you here. We are going to go ahead and send links to your game and resources to every participant here today, as well as everyone who signed up. Again, apologies for the computer mess up, very 2020 problem in the beginning. We're also going to share links to that on social media and on YouTube when we get your awesome talk out. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Thank you to our audience for showing up, and I look forward to keeping in touch and hearing more about the war games that you're up to.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed today very much, and I hope everybody else did too.